Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Andrew Mumford to present our coming seminar, webinar. As you might have seen from the publicity material, we have been conducting a project on proxy conflicts sponsored by Carnegie Corporation New York, looking at how the conflict in Syria and Afghanistan may be compared and what we can learn from that experience. And we have been quite fortunate to have used and relied on the pioneering research work that Professor Andrew Mumford has produced over the years on that very topic. Professor Mumford is a professor of war studies at the University of Nottingham. He has written 3 books on elements of modern war, including proxy warfare. That was published in 2013. His paper, Proxy Warfare and Future of Conflict, is the second most downloaded article in the history of RUSI Journal, which is quite a feat. He has acted as consultant to the UK Ministry of Defence and NATO on issues pertaining to hybrid warfare, and he has an upcoming book on the West war against ISIS, looking at the tension in Syria and Iraq, obviously. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Mumford to talk to us about his research on proxy conflicts. The floor is yours.
Shahram, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with you virtually. It's a shame I couldn't be with you in person in Melbourne, but events have superseded us. But I'm delighted to be able to share my research with you. Let me just share this screen with you for 1 minute. Here we go. I'll put that in slide mode. Do shout if you can't see this. Fantastic, great. So as Shahram just mentioned, this presentation is part of my upcoming book. He says, starting his presentation with a shameless plug. This is research from one of the chapters of the book, which, as Shahram just said, is called The West's War Against ISIS. If you're interested, coming out in February 2021 with IB Taurus. There we go. I promise that's the last plug I will do for my new book. This is an evolution of quite a few years worth, nearly a decade's worth of work that I've been doing on the phenomena of proxy wars. I was frustrated, I think is the best word, with the state of research on proxy wars about 10 years ago. I was frustrated with the way in which it was indelibly linked with the Cold War. I was frustrated with the way in which it wasn't being seen in conceptual clarity or conceptual isolation, particularly when it came to discussing external influence in civil wars. So I wrote the book that Shahram just mentioned there in 2013 called Proxy Warfare as a very small attempt to try and stake out some conceptual clarity for this particular topic. And I must admit, prescience is not one of my strong points. However, when I came to writing my new book on Operation Inherent Resolve, particularly the chapter on the proxy war effort against ISIS, I came to realize that some of the things I was warning about in my previous book had come true. We were seeing an increased risk aversion amongst states, particularly Western states, towards large-scale military interventions and putting boots on the ground. We were seeing large amounts of blowback because of the short-term desire to get a short-term fix to a problem, to satiate a need to influence a particular civil war. All of these things culminated in this new book, and this presentation is a little bit of, is only, obviously I've only got half an hour, so this is just going to be a very short, but hopefully rewarding glimpse of the ways in which I've seen the proxy wars evolve for and against ISIS. But in reality, what we are what we've seen is that the proxy wars for and against ISIS are actually the proxy wars for and against Bashar al-Assad as well. And it is impossible to separate the conflict against the Assad regime in Damascus and the proxy war against ISIS, which were parallel, they were intertwined. Let me start, as I must always do, like a well-trained academic with some conceptual definitions. This is the definition from that 2013 book that I mentioned when I was saying that proxy wars occur when third parties indirectly intervene in a pre-existing war in order to shape the outcome of that conflict in their favour. If we take that as the conceptual premise, then the logic that underpins proxy wars, as far as I'm concerned, in regards to the West's war against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, is that logic of indelible, universal trend of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And we've seen, not just throughout the Cold War, but both before and afterwards, that is an incredibly flawed logic, imbued with a significant amount of long-term consequences. But the short-term allure of proxy wars has not diminished, and I don't think will diminish, particularly given other trends in the international system that I'll touch on in a bit. I mentioned the link just a minute or two ago between my 2013 book trying to conceptualize proxy wars and this book on Operation Inherent Resolve, and the links that I'm seeing are significant, because the war against ISIS was largely a proxy war, and I found when I was writing this book that it was indelible. I could not escape the indirect level of assistance that ISIS was being fought with by the West. And it's no huge revelation, but I think that it goes without saying that the operational planning for Operation Inherent Resolve was haunted by the ghost of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and that we cannot escape the impact of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 on the continual appeal of war by proxy in the subsequent decades. What that I think that has done is increased the aversion to risk, increased a desire to avoid large-scale military interventions and boots on the ground, especially in the Middle East. And this is something that unites those disparate political figures of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And that is one of the major continuities, I think, one of the few, but certainly one of the major continuities between the Obama and the Trump administration is an instinctive aversion to large-scale military interventions. But that still, though, has left this desire. America has not been willing to cede its strategic interest, particularly in the Middle East, but it just doesn't want to do it directly. It doesn't want to do it on a large scale. Proxy wars have filled that gap. So just a sort of a very brief history of how the United States became involved in the proxy war in Syria against ISIS, and indeed how that then dovetailed with the war against Bashar al-Assad. 2017, things really become important for raising the profile of the proxy war, because President Trump cancels the CIA's funding program on weapons and training program for its Syrian rebels, which they'd codenamed Timber Sycamore. Now, this is interesting. I mentioned the CIA here. The American proxy war against ISIS is perhaps one of the first proxy wars that the United States, who have been a very prolific user, as I'm sure you all know your proxy war history, a very prolific user of indirect intervention. This marks the Syrian intervention in the Syrian Civil War marks the first time that the two branches of the United States government have technically been waging a proxy war against each other. There was an incident in 2016, which I think just perfectly epitomizes the strategic confusion that really epitomised the intervention and the way in which the Americans really hadn't, through both Obama and Trump, had not really grasped the situation in Syria. There was an incident in 2016 where the CIA-backed rebels of the Furqar al-Sultan group turned their weapons against the Pentagon-backed YPG. So you had the Pentagon funding one set of rebels, the CIA funding another set of rebels, and they're fighting each other. And this rather, I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. This rather bizarre incident really comes to epitomise the, not just the high profile nature of proxy war in the Syrian context, but also the utter chaos with which it was being managed by Washington. By cancelling the CIA's programme, Trump indicates that actually American priorities in Syria are shifting. Essentially what it says is Assad can stay if ISIS goes. And this becomes important because it firstly delineates between the, I mean, if we're talking about paradoxes or juxtapositions or what have you, the label moderate rebel, which has entered the political and academic lexicon as a result of the Syrian Civil War, has got to be up there as one of the most perverse. But what Washington now came to deem the moderate rebels is what Damascus and Moscow then start to term terrorist. So then we start to see an interesting semantic divide in how proxy wars are discussed between intervening powers. But also what it does is it's symptomatic of the way in which Bashar al-Assad's continuing rule in Damascus becomes the lesser of two evils for Washington to deal with. And I think Obama hadn't got fully to the bottom of the conundrum about how do you solve a problem like Bashar al-Assad and ISIS at the same time and attain a positive outcome in both. And he never came to I don't think he came to a full appreciation of how he could do that. And I think Trump grasped the nettle, not necessarily out of any strategic genius, goes without saying, but because of a realization that he needed to slim down US priorities and US presence in country. That Assad clearly became the lesser of two evils and ISIS became the priority. So Assad got to stay for two reasons, I think, linking this slide to the last slide. Assad got to stay largely, A, because Saddam Hussein went. Assad stays because Saddam goes. And the impact that the invasion of Iraq had on future American intervention in the Middle East is significant. Secondly, Assad got to stay because ISIS had to go. And the two could not happen at the same time because you remove, I think it became clear that if you removed Assad before you got rid of ISIS, that ISIS would take control and fill power vacuums inside Syria. So that was the strategic conundrum that Operation Inherent Resolve was wrapped in. But of course, we've got to look back. Everything starts, of course, with the Arab Spring, that thing we so optimistically called the Arab Spring in 2011. But what's interesting is that these proxy wars going on in Syria do not begin in 2014 with the rise of ISIS. They start years earlier in the wake of the Arab Spring, because the American intervention and also the wider, as we can see here, countries from the wider Gulf region, such as Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, start a proxy war against Assad. We see how a military operations center is established in Istanbul, for example, in 2012. These proxy wars predate the fight against ISIS, but they become indelibly interlinked 2 years later with the fight against ISIS, but they also get confused. The strategic priorities get diluted because you've got different rebel groups, different intervening third parties pulling the civil war in different directions. And in 2012, I think obviously the rather fateful decision was made by the West to choose the very loose coalition of the Free Syrian Army, which is a rather chaotic alphabet soup of about, I think it's about 76 different militia groups. So the FSA is a huge umbrella organization, not very well cohered, and this poses a huge amount of problems because labeling the FSA as moderate rebels, to use that semantic paradox, becomes a useful way for the West to justify its proxy intervention in Syria. But from an operational point of view, the FSA is a pretty terrible proxy to have chosen, largely because of its disparate nature. 76 as it comes to pass its own different priorities. The rise of ISIS, of course, does change all of this and has a huge impact on the direction of the proxy war. What we see is the CIA, Timber Sycamore I was mentioning earlier, starting arms shipments to the FSA in September 2013, and this significantly militarizes the American proxy war. It starts to think about how, it starts to think, denote how the priorities are shifting, how AQI's, Al-Qaeda in Iraq's morphing into the Islamic State is starting to concern the Americans, certainly not to the extent to which they saw the establishment of the caliphate coming necessarily. It was a rather small strategic surprise to them. But they are starting to see ways in which they can militarize their activity inside Syria to a large extent. Now, by the spring of 2014, the CIA estimates that it's trained about 1,000 Syrian rebels. In and of itself, that might seem like an impressive number. But this is the key thing to remember about Syria and the proxy war, is that this is a proxy war that is not undertaken in splendid isolation. The West are not the only intervening third-party powers. The proxy war inside Syria is, of course, not an exclusively Western activity. The impact of Russia and the impact of Iran is huge. This is a multinational proxy war, not necessarily unprecedented in the history of such type of conflicts, but on a scale that had not been seen for a long time. So the CIA perhaps think that their 1,000 fighter training program is a success. However, the Iranians and its allies in Hezbollah have trained at the same time over 20,000 Shia proxies. And again, this is another added layer of complexity to this whole thing. And this is one of the reasons, and I talk about it a little bit in my forthcoming book. I promised I wouldn't do any more plugs for that. Apologies. This is one of the key problems with the West's proxy war strategy inside Syria and Iraq as part of Operation Inherent Resolve, is that the West is largely backing Sunni rebels. Therefore, it can only really it can't really offer an effective political solution to the problems inside Syria because of the way in which it seems to have planted its flag firmly in the partisan divide in favor of the Sunnis. And the Iranians are more than happy to exploit that, of course, and this really draws another line in the sand between these two contending proxy wars, between that of the West and that of the Iranians in particular, who frankly have the best proxy war of all. I think the Iranians really come out of all of this with the most strategic gain. But that's something I can come back to maybe in the Q&A. The result, of course, of all of this is a stalemate in the civil war, no negotiated peace. Assad gets to stay, and the war against the expanding influence and the expanding territory of ISIS stalls. Oh, there we go, 78 different factions. in the FSA by 2016, all of them receiving to some degree American proxy assistance. Now, this is hugely problematic from an operational point of view, because once the Americans made a strategic decision not to put boots on the ground, not to overthrow Assad kinetically, they put all their eggs in the basket of ensuring that local forces can assist them in attaining strategic priorities, however clear they may be. But the trouble is, the FSA is, as I mentioned earlier, is a pretty poor conduit for this because of its rather fragmented nature, multiple levels of hierarchy amongst those 78 different militia groups. Those themselves are broken down into different armed opposition groups. So actually trying to coordinate a proxy, which is difficult enough at the best of times, suddenly becomes 78 times more difficult inside Syria. This largely nullifies, and this is again one of the juxtapositions of trying to manage a proxy war, is even if the attempt, as was done with the creation of the so-called Friends of Syria group in 2012, even if the attempted strategic coordination of a proxy war looks like a rather clean, smooth, multinational, linked up effort, if at the tactical level, on the ground, the proxies themselves are incapable, unwilling, unfit to actually do the fighting and attain those goals, then it is all for naught. So this really does highlight the importance, or the difficulty, I should say, of trying to wage proxy war solely at a strategic level, and shows how actually further on down that chain, if your proxies are not up to it. In other words, if you're, and this is the problem, right? Because the Americans were looking for proxies who could both fight and eventually govern, particularly in areas eventually liberated from ISIS. You are lucky if you could find the ones that could fight, largely because, as they found out with the FSA, the standard day rate that they were paying FSA fighters was actually being doubled by ISIS. So ISIS is turning around to these large swathes of the sort of non-ideologically committed young Syrian men and doubling the day rate. And this, of course, becomes a huge appeal to young men, and something that the Americans don't grasp and deal with quickly enough. So again, they're losing out. Another reason, of course, is that, as I mentioned, the CIA and the Pentagon are pumping huge amounts of weapons to these militias. They're not tracking where they go. We have logged instances of where American airdrops of weapons that are meant to be airdropped on areas controlled by affiliated FSA militias actually are either dropped on the wrong site and actually are dropped behind ISIS lines, or instances where the weapons, high-tech weapons that the Americans have given to different FSA militia groups, are then sold to ISIS for cash, and then those militia fighters just disappear. These are perennial problems in the management of proxy wars, and they are manifest significantly inside Syria. But this again, you could say, okay, so what's the alternative? This gets to the heart of the policy conundrum when trying to prosecute the proxy war. Is a proxy war strategy too timid? Is a proxy war strategy simply a half-hearted way of trying to influence things from a distance? It's sort of arm's length conflict. Or does that simply mean, does the absence or the rejection of a proxy war strategy mean that you immediately have a binary of either zero intervention or all out, complete, boots on the ground military intervention? Is therefore proxy war a happy medium? I don't think anybody really, other than Iran, I must say, who, in the words of one Iraqi official that I came across, said the Iranians have a PhD in this type of warfare, which I thought was a really nice line. That other than the Iranians, I don't think anybody really gets, particularly the Western nations or the Gulf states, doesn't really get anything that they really wanted out of this intervention. It's all rather compromised. Talking of things that are compromised, Obama's red lines. This, I think, in the bigger scheme of Obama's foreign policy, is perhaps one of the points he would like to least dwell on. His reluctance to act on those red lines of chemical weapons used by Assad was indicative, and from a proxy war perspective, looking at what the Americans were doing in that point inside Syria, I think it becomes important because, in the words of one of Australia's top strategic thinkers, David Kilcullen, he said that what this does is it shifted the American policy from regime change to regime behavior change. And I think that observation is quite astute, because it comes back to what I was saying earlier about how Assad can stay because ISIS has to go. So even if tipping the balance in favor of a major regime changing invasion, or indeed authorizing a massive rolling set of airstrikes against Damascus and against Assad's key intelligence, military, communications hubs, became a step too far for Obama, who had made his entire pitch for the presidency, let's not forget, on pointing out his opposition to the Iraq War and realizing what a mess George W. Bush had got the country into, and promising to change American foreign policy in that regard. He'd sort of set himself up for a little bit of a failure there. But this is the problem. When the strategic logic of a proxy war is based on my enemy's enemy is my friend, the trouble is Assad had pitched himself astutely, cunningly, as a de facto ally in the war against ISIS. And by promising to utilize the efforts of the Syrian military against ISIS in his country, Assad guaranteed his own survival because of the way in which this particular proxy war made some very strange bedfellows out of the proxy war coalition. The very fact that you've got the Iranians and the Americans and the Syrians technically all on the same side trying to defeat ISIS is quite a strange combination when you think of it. And Assad was very astute, I think, in trying to pitch himself. And again, there were some instances at press conferences during the Syrian Civil War where he falsely claimed, but the impact of what he said, I think, was not lost, claimed that he was being, I think his words were, brought inside the tent in the war against ISIS. So all of these were sort of very clever ways in which he exploited the dividing lines that this particular proxy war had thrown up. And he realized that the my enemy's enemy is my friend logic could be turned against the Americans if he pretended to be their friend in the war against ISIS. And this is the problem that the creation of the caliphate had on how the West dealt with Assad, because of the way in which they significantly embraced war by proxy as the main strategic lever through which they realized they were going to have to fight ISIS, because neither Obama nor Trump were actively willing to put boots on the ground. Now, this is all tied up, and what we see from 2014 onwards is a rather unsatisfactory proxy war. From a Western perspective, I would say. We see, okay, a fairly significant set of airstrikes. We see a fairly large amount of special forces operations, which is probably another parallel observation to what I was saying at the very beginning of this, the issue that I raised in my 2013 book on proxy war about increased risk aversion. War by the process of risk management has seen, I think, a secondary effect after the reliance on proxy wars as a result of this is also a parallel reliance on air power and on special forces operations. That they are perhaps the upper limit of kinetic activity that Western states are willing to undertake in this strategic context in the post-Iraq war environment. So this is one of the key issues here, is that despite all of those limited kinetic activities, proxy war is still the main lever through which the West tries to defeat ISIS. But it becomes clear pretty early on that actually, despite Assad's weasel words, he's not interested in fighting ISIS. He's interested in fighting the FSA. So Assad turns the American proxy war against itself, and actually is utilizing an American proxy as his enemy. They are the key threat to his regime, not ISIS. He realizes that, but the West really has its hands tied because of this reluctance to utilize large-scale kinetic activity, and an appreciation of actually what that would do. So this convenience with which Assad treats the American proxy war has implications for the way in which the West can fight ISIS. So just a few final thoughts about the consequences of all of this. Proxy war as a counterinsurgency strategy was pretty much abandoned by Obama. Trump clearly has no intention of pursuing the removal of Assad, given his full retreat and the American withdrawal from Syria. Indeed, Assad's position has been subsequently strengthened by American troop withdrawal, with obviously Russian troops coming in and filling that vacuum. Even the fact that the caliphate has rolled up, that there is no territorial caliphate anymore, Assad still remains secure. I would say, though, one word of caution: there are still potentially tens of thousands of ISIS fighters waiting in strategic lull, I think. There were many instances, many reports of ISIS fighters fleeing over the border into Turkey as the caliphate was rolled up in 2017-18. And I think that Trump's talk of defeat is dangerous, and they are certainly not destroyed. They are degraded at best. And I think the rise of the so-called Wilayats, up to 9 different countries around the world, is perhaps the next stage that the West might need to look at. Tackling ISIS affiliates in countries like the Philippines or Afghanistan, maybe this is something, Shahram, that your project might want to look at. Learning the lessons of the proxy war from Syria is going to have significant implications for how the West deals with the next iteration of ISIS's evolution. ISIS is not destroyed. And I think Trump's language of defeat is optimistic at best, dangerous at worst, because it will, talking of a defeated ISIS can lead to complacency. And the one thing that the history of its precursor in Al-Qaeda in Iraq teaches us is that assuming its defeat or its quietness, and assuming that as a synonym for victory, is ultimately will lead to some strategic peril. So a few concluding thoughts. Syria is an anarchic proxy war, absolutely. We've seen a broad network of shifting relationships, and that's very difficult to manage, and it's very difficult to coordinate a shared strategic goal. The anti-ISIS coalition made some very strange bedfellows out of a strange conglomeration of states and non-state actors. And this is one of the sort of key portraits of this particularly strange proxy war. It's drawn in other regional powers as well as global powers. So it's really mixed up. This is not a purely regional proxy war. It's had a much more internationalized dimension too. And the result of all of this really is to my mind, Saudi Arabia and Iran battling for regional supremacy to the last Syrian. And this is the key thing I think we always need to come back to, is that the victims of proxy wars are always the people on the ground. Proxy war is a short-term strategy. And it's very easy for third parties who are intervening to walk away. And they often do. They always do, leaving the consequences of their armed intervention for another day. And this is one of the key legacies of this particular proxy war, is that there are untold numbers of weapons now floating around Syria, and the Syrian people have been made to suffer. And this is one of the important things that the literature on proxy wars really doesn't necessarily take into sufficient account, is the consequences, the human consequence of third-party intervention. And that is one of the sad legacies of the proxy war inside Syria. I will leave it there. And Shahram, would you like me to stop sharing my screen now?
Yes, please. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks for sticking to the time. And thanks for your fascinating insights on proxy dimensions in Syria, ISIS, Bashar al-Assad. So many different actors at work, obviously. It is quite a mess.
Yes.
I'd like to open the floor to questions. I have a few questions myself, but I think I should allow others to raise their questions first. So if you don't mind using the raise hand function, I already see that there is a question in the chat. I might read that for you from Philip Eliasson. What's your view of the Russian step up in Syria in 2015? Did it help Europe and the Mediterranean, or did it more play to NATO versus Russia challenge?
The Russian intervention, it's a good question, Philip, is the joker in the pack, right? It's the spoiler in the Western proxy war, largely because Putin's intervention is far more muscular than that of the West. It exposes the timidity of the West's proxy war strategy. It's bolder, it's far more targeted, and I would say that actually it's deliberately designed to provoke the West, to expose the West, to embarrass the West. I mean, and it's exactly what Putin does best, and it was very effective. And you see the way, as I mentioned at the very end now, you see the way in which there are still instances of American, before Trump's withdrawal, of American troops and Russian troops getting into little skirmishes, right? The Russian presence, the Russian military presence in Syria was very aggressive. And I think the issue of NATO that Philip raises there is an interesting one, because I don't know if you remember an incident in, I think it was 2015, when the Turks shot down a Russian jet which had strayed inside Turkish airspace. And the Turks had said that this was a fairly regular occurrence. It had been warned, and it was shot down. The Russians were pushing boundaries, I think, as a revisionist power, as a norm-bending power. What we saw in Russia, inside Syria, by the Russians, fits the same pattern that we've seen the Russian actions inside Ukraine. They will bend norms. They will push right up to the sort of the threshold of legitimate response. I think their strategic logic is based on that, and I think they get a lot out of it. And they were, I think, quite successful in stepping up their actions inside Syria, because regardless of your view of it, the one thing you can't say about the Russians is you didn't know what they wanted. Whereas if you said, well, what does the West want out of this Syrian civil war? That was actually a much harder question to answer. So regardless of the strategic benefit or consequence of all of it, the Russian strategy was far more brazen, far more aggressive, yet clearer. So I think that's the complex legacy of the Syrian intervention inside Syria. There is, he says shamelessly again, there is going to be there's an entire chapter in the new book looking at what I call the alternative war, the interventions of Russia, of Iran, and Turkey as well. So there's more in there.
Okay, I see a few hands raised. Mohsen I see raised, and Abbas. So
Dara, are you controlling the hands, the mic?
You should be able to unmute yourself, Abbas. I've automated this time.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I just have a conceptual question about proxy relations. As you said, proxy war is a short-term strategy, but in some cases like Iran, Hezbollah, and Pakistan with the Afghan Taliban, it's a relation more than for 2 decades. So the question is that the relation actually based on shared interest, the sustained relation, or a strategic environment in the regional level or global level. Which one is the main kinds of generative mechanism that can sustain the relation for a longer time? Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good question. The key thing for me about trying to understand the longevity of such relationships, we have to look at the changing power dynamics between them. The original power imbalance that you might have between what I always call a benefactor and the proxy, right? There is a rather obvious, to use in realist terms, there is a power imbalance between the two. I don't think any relationship that lasts that long remains static. And the classic example I use is the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. Another example of an original benefactor and a proxy with a power imbalance whose relationship has lasted decades. But the balance has shifted. The partnership has moved on, often to the point of equals, of an autonomous partnership. There comes a point when an initial benefactor proxy relationship will morph into something akin to an alliance that we might necessarily recognize in state-based terms. Yes, of course, the strategic environment is going to change, but that in and of itself is a product of a change in relationship between the two partners itself. So I think you have to, and forgive me for sounding too realist here, but we do have to look at power relations between the benefactor and the proxy. I wouldn't necessarily state that because such a relationship like those ones that you've just indicated there last for so long that necessarily means that the relationship is static in an original setting. It will morph, it will develop, and I often struggle actually to think of long-term benefactor and proxy relations that have remained rigidly hierarchical, particularly because a long-term relationship is almost always going to benefit the proxy more, because they will have really milked that relationship, built a political strength, built money, built a weapons cache, all of those different things. So if this is something that your research looks into, I would say look at the power relations between the two, because they will shift. And even though the labels might not necessarily change, increasing levels of autonomy from the proxy itself, I think, has been a hallmark of contemporary proxy wars, particularly when there's been a long-term relationship between two actors.
Thank you, Andrew. I see more hands going up. Mohsen, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very fascinating. I've got 3 questions, try to say that very briefly. First one was about third parties intervening in a pre-existing war, particularly in the case of Syria. Wasn't it this proxy war actually fueling a war or starting the war? Or could we say that this one, at least this one in Syria, was not a pre-existing war before these proxies were supported by external states? And from that also, whether it was a counter-insurgency strategy that US was employing in Syria, or that was indeed an insurgency strategy, because they were at the same time trying to remove Bashar Assad from power. And the second question is about the CIA covert operation. You mentioned Timber Sycamore. Back in 2014, we also had this congressional approval for overt support, or let's say explicit support, to these rebel groups in Syria. The operation was called Train and Equip Program. Halfway through 2015, there were only 4 or 5 trained fighters who were actually trained under this program. Why did you specifically mention 2016 and 17, whereas in 2015, US could pretty much realize that, well, this is not going well in Syria. The outcome of this training program, 2014 to 2015, didn't work. And the last one, you mentioned that Assad got to stay because Saddam was gone. And I'm not sure whether you have anything to add about Gaddafi. Was it because Assad stayed actually because Gaddafi was removed? We saw how the Security Council did not approve any, they did not come to a unanimous decision to have a humanitarian intervention in Syria, primarily because of Libya. Thank you very much.
Great questions. Let me try and address one in turn. Was the Syrian Civil War a proxy war from the start? I would say no, but it became a proxy war very, very, very quickly. I'm more inclined to see the origins of the, as I mentioned in the presentation, the origins of the Syrian Civil War in the Arab Spring. But let's not kid ourselves, right? Proxy wars have been universal for time immemorial, and they are the strategic equivalent of a leech, right? They feed off pre-existing organisms, and they seek pre-existing wars out pretty damn quickly. I don't think necessarily significant amounts of proxy activity were available from the very beginning or fostering the Civil War, but they were present from the start. You're right to raise the issue of the Train and Equip program. It was a debacle, absolute debacle. Why wasn't it? Why couldn't they see the writing on the wall earlier? They doubled down. I think you're right. Looking back now, it was clear to see that from a target of several thousand fighters, bear in mind, this is the Pentagon, the Train and Equip program is the Pentagon run one. From a target of several thousand, you're right. The reports that came out, I think it was General Vogel had to admit to a congressional committee that actually it was only about five fighters. I mean, that's just outrageously bad. But they doubled down. And I think this was a way in which they had no other choice, because they had actively dismissed every other strategic option. They had dismissed the option of boots on the ground. Where does that then leave you? Well, you have to ensure that your local actors on the ground can do the job. So they mixed it up. They did have, after that testimony and the realization that the Train and Equip program was going badly, they did reorganize it. They did reorganize it, but the results were still pretty much the same. They were not good. Your third question is my favorite one, because it's one I've not really considered: the role of Gaddafi. That is a great question. My initial response, I don't think Gaddafi was that high on the American strategic radar. I don't really think the Americans cared about Gaddafi all that much. And if you think about who was really leading the charge, when I pictured that Western intervention in Libya, I always go to pictures of Nicolas Sarkozy. I always imagine this really as a real French-led thing with British support. I don't really see the Americans present significantly. So I think that's lower down. I think the Iraq War, the removal of Saddam, becomes this huge moment, this sort of a Vietnam-esque moment in the American foreign policy establishment that is impossible to overcome. It's a totem pole in contemporary American foreign and defense policy. And yes, the removal of Gaddafi becomes peripheral to that, but it's not the lodestone from which, and the next generation, and I think we might be talking generationally, particularly, well, I say particularly if Biden wins in November. This is the irony, right? I think one of the few things that might unite Biden and Trump is that they are not necessarily keen to see an extension of American military boots on the ground in the Middle East. So that's how I would answer your questions. It goes without saying, particularly if I don't get to answer all the questions that are either coming up in the chat or I don't get to get to all of you with your hands up right now, I'm more than happy if you reach out to me via email afterwards. I think the last slide that I didn't put up has got my email address on it, or reach out to me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to engage in further discussion with anybody.
Thanks, Andrew. Next question is Osmalek.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for a great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk about like the war economy side of a proxy war. So like resources and the exploitation that comes from the economic ventures. How significant is that in a proxy? Thank you.
A really good question. The answer that I would say from a political perspective is that the political economy of a proxy war will always on the surface seem cheaper than the political economy of a direct intervention. And this is why proxy wars have inherently been seen by politicians as war on the cheap. And it's there's one of the anecdotes I started that I used in my proxy war book was Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. He was talking about arming proxies in East Asia in the early Cold War period. And he said that arming others to do your fighting for you is what he called the cheapest insurance in the world. And I thought that was telling, right? That statement says everything you need to know about, I think, a Western political interpretation of the political economy of proxy wars, because it does reduce your overheads hugely, because putting your own troops in a battle space is a huge financial outlay, of course. And it's not just about the kinetic cost of an operation, it's about all the logistical cost too, which is probably more expensive. However, if all you've got to do is dump a load of arms from the back of an aeroplane on a set of fighters, or get one of your operatives to rock up to a tent in the middle of the desert with suitcases full of dollars, then the political allure is significant because the economic allure is significant. Now, this is where the economics and the politics do come into tension, because this is one of the key reasons I think that proxy wars have proved so appealing over the centuries, perhaps even the millennia, right? Is because of the way in which they think that states feel that they can get what they want at a fraction of the cost without sacrificing political risk, without sacrificing the blood of your own fighters, and significantly, and this gets to the heart of your point, without a significant economic outlay. It seems to be the best of all worlds, but that's the allure, that's the appeal. It's rarely the reality, because as we've seen, and this is one, perhaps this is an interesting thing, if this is your research field, an interesting thing to consider is actually the post-proxy war economic consequences, because often, and this comes back to, I think it was Abbas's question about long-term proxy and benefactor relationships, actually the economic outlay of a long-term relationship can be significant, because if you think about how much a benefactor might have to keep propping up a proxy, but even if they do get into government, so you think about long-term ways in which perhaps even a proxy war ends, but then that assistance, economic assistance that might have occurred during the proxy war phase, then that might have to morph into outright aid, development and political assistance, particularly if your proxy wins, right? And they're now a new government and you need to support them. So there are other ways in which the economic outlay of a proxy war can be manifest, especially in a post-conflict environment, but it's still the product of that original political desire to intervene and think that you can get what you want at a fraction of the cost with a fraction of the risk.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we have time for one last question. Mahmoud, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute?
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating. I was wondering, it's not relevant directly to your presentation of proxy war per se, but do you think there will be like a battle in near future? I mean, in short term on Idlib? It looks very,
Yeah. It's
Looks very ominous.
this is, yeah, it is ominous, and this is why I really wanted to labour the point about how the language of defeat is problematic. The issue, I think Trump has felt that he can draw a line under Syria because US troops have gone, ISIS is defeated, the caliphate is gone. And in the sort of black and white world of Trump's foreign policy, that is an issue dealt with. It's far more problematic. It's far more complex, and little pockets of resistance, little pockets of problems, flare-ups. I don't think they are going to be high at all on the American strategic radar. And I think the entire Western logic of the proxy war in Syria was that it would be the Syrians themselves who shouldered the burden for actually defeating ISIS, getting rid of Assad. And if they could do it with a little bit of American money and a little bit of American weaponry, fine. But the problem is that it's not all over, it's not all gone. And this is why, whether you've got issues in Idlib, whether you've got issues in regards to the, I think intelligence reports are about 10,000 plus ISIS fighters who are in retreat, in hiding. All of these problems are going to stack up. And what now seems like an ominous little situation in Idlib could join up with other little ominous problems that we can see. But I think he's not on Washington's radar right now. It does not want to see them, and will create much bigger problems down the line. The proxy war might be over, but the ongoing conflict is certainly not. And that's a bigger issue. It really is. And hopefully, if we can do what we can to keep the eye on the situation, but it's not heading anywhere good.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Obviously, this has been, and proxy war is a very complex phenomena, and as we have seen, quite devastating and disastrous for the population in Syria and in any other theater of conflict where proxy relations do happen. So thanks for sharing your research. Thanks for being so generous with us. I know you had to get up really early to join us. It's getting late for us, but it's very early in the morning for you. So I invite everyone to join me in thanking Andrew. Perhaps you can unmute and clap.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you indeed, Shahram, for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to share. Thank you for your fantastic questions. As I said, please do reach out via email. It's andrew.mumford@nottingham.ac.uk. Again, if anyone had any more questions, I'll more than happily continue the conversation. And hopefully, at least, I've already sold 41 copies of my new book in Australia. So I appreciate it.
Indeed, you have. As I mentioned, this is part of our project sponsored by Carnegie Corporation. We could not hold a conference, but I'm glad that you could join us on Zoom. We do have more Zoom webinars happening in the coming weeks. I have shared the MESF's website where we advertise our webinars, so please visit the website and sign up so you get notification of coming events. And this session has been recorded. It will be on MESF YouTube in a few days. So anyone wants to revisit the conversation, you're more than welcome to. Have a good evening, all.
Thanks, everyone.